Hey there and welcome to another Unreal 4 shoot 'em up tutorial. So in this video we're going to add the projectile class, or the base class for the projectiles that we'll be using for the player as we go through. Now in future videos what we're doing is taking a look at something called inheritance. If you're not familiar with that, then I'll go into depth about that as and when we start implementing it a bit more, and it's one of those things that will make a lot more sense when you start using it. But the main concept behind it is we're going to make a parent class, which will be what we're doing today. And any future projectile types that we make can be a child of that class, and it will inherit certain variables and functionalities that we expose inside of the parent blueprint. The idea behind this is it's going to save us reprogramming or coding out the same thing over and over. So we know, for instance, that all projectiles are going to need to do a few things, which is going to be applying damage. They need to be destroyed when they hit something. They're going to be moving in some direction, and so on, sort of generic things like that. So what we can do is we can code that once inside of the parent blueprint, and then any child blueprints that inherit from that will simply be able to call their parent's version of that code and do the same thing without any implementation. So it saves us coding the same thing. So if we have like 5 different projectiles at one point, theoretically what it means is that rather than coding something 5 times, we code it once and then it just shares it between the classes. To begin, if we right click anywhere inside of the blueprints folder and create a blueprint class, and this will be of type actor. It's just something that needs to be spawned in the world. So we need an actor, and we'll call this BP_projectile player base, like so. This is just for naming convention's sake. This will, when we make more projectiles, this will put things quite nicely alphabetically, so we know where to find things. So this will be the projectile for the player because we're going to have enemy projectiles. So that will differentiate it there. And then we've called this base, and then we'll have a specific name for the child blueprints that derive from this. So if we go in here and open this, first of all, 2 things we need in the components. We want a static mesh, and we want to grab this and put it on the default scene root so that the static mesh is now the default root component, and we'll just rename this projectile. And then we want a projectile movement, so we'll get the projectile movement component, and we'll set all of this up a little bit later. And then for the variables, the 2 things we'll focus on at the moment, the way that I want to approach this is that when the enemy or the player spawns a projectile, they will have control over the color of the projectile, which means that we can change things kind of dynamically and on the fly for different types of firing functionalities. So when they spawn something, they can say, I want this to be this big and this color. So we're going to expose some of these variables here. So the first thing we need to make to do that is a variable called Projectile Color. And over in the variable type, we just need to find a linear color. So if we select the linear color node, and the important thing here to make sure that we can do that editing when we spawn this is we need to tick the expose on spawn option here, and we'll make that editable. And the editable thing is, you'll notice the eye has appeared down here, so you can toggle that on and off by clicking the eye over here as well. And then the next thing we'll need to make, we'll actually do it a slightly different way. If we go to the construction script, first of all, if we control drag in the projectile, and we want to find the create dynamic material instance node. So this is just creating an instance of a material that we give this static mesh, which can be updated or changed dynamically. So if we plug that into the first execution pin, and then down here, what we want to do is we can leave this blank, the source material, because that will be updated when we start creating all of this a bit later. Then off of the return value, when this material has been created, we need to store a reference to this. This will be what is updated and edited later. So if we right click on the pin and promote that to variable, that will link up our execution pin as well. And we will just call this the projectile material. And just to keep things tidy, I'm going to control drag in another reference of the projectile. So you could drag off of this pin if you wanted to change something else, but then we've got a few more wires going around than I want. So I'm just going to get another reference that does exactly the same thing. And this time we want to find the set world scale 3D. So this is how we're going to plug in a value that we update later. And again, this will be done when this is created. So if we right click on here, we'll promote this to variable as well, and we'll just call this scale. By default, we want to give this a value because at the moment it's 0, 0, 0, and if we forget to put something in here, then we won't be able to see the projectile when we spawn it. So just make this 1, 1, 1, so we'll get a cube or something, at least when we first spawn this. And then finally, we just want to drag in the projectile movement. This is the component that will be driving the logic behind moving the projectile forward. And off of here, we want to drag out, and we want to set max speed, so set max speed. And we also want to drag out and set initial speed. So these two, you'll notice this isn't something that we've created. If we go into the projectile movement we can go over here to the values and we can see it has two variables. Well, it has loads of variables, but it has two specifically, one called initial speed and one called max speed, which are these two. So all we're doing is we're getting the component and then we're finding some information within that component, and that's going to allow us to update that in a moment. So if we just drag in the execution pins again to get this to do something, and if we just set the max speed to be 1000, this is just a quick tip I wanted to show. If we then right click like we've done in the past and promote this to variable, we'll call this speed. And remember that scale started at 000 because we didn't put anything in that box. Whereas because we've put something in this box, if we now look at speed and compile so that the values update, we can see this already has the value of 1000. So if you type something in here and then promote it to a variable, it just simply remembers the value that you put in, and the promoted variable just inherits that value straight away. So a little time saver there. And then once we've set the max speed, if we just drag that over to the initial speed, so they're both going to be the same thing. The fastest this projectile can ever move is the speed it starts at as well. And there we have the construction of a projectile. So nice and simple. I think the only thing we probably want to change is if you select the projectile movement, go down to velocity. At the moment it's set on the velocity to 1 on the x-axis, which is left and right. So it's going to be going right. And as our screen is going up, which is the z-axis, we just want to make the velocity 1 on the z-axis. And all that does, quite simply, is it takes the values that we've got here, so 1000, and it will multiply it by this value. So if you leave a value of 1 here, it's going to times the max speed by 1, so that's 1000, and it's going to make that move 1000 units across the screen if you leave it in the x. If you make it -1, it will move it 1000 units across the screen, left across the screen. And what we're doing here is we're just saying move 1000 units over time up the screen on the z-axis. So that's why we just needed to make that change there. And again, just to make sure this does make sense, if you wanted it to go down the screen instead of up, then we'd make this -1. Okay, so if we move over to the event graph, first thing we want to do is, now that we have created our material to be edited, we can drag in the reference, so control drag in the projectile material, and we want to say set vector parameter value. We'll drag the execution node from the event begin play there, and we just want to give this a name at the moment of color. And remember this name later. This isn't going to work at the moment because we haven't made a material. But when we do make a material to be the parent of this, we're going to put a parameter value in there called color. And that's how we're going to update this and access it. So it's very important that you remember the way that you spelt this, including the casing, because it's case sensitive as well. So we'll just keep that as a placeholder for now. And if it doesn't work, just remember to come back here, and you've probably named both of the variables slightly differently. And then if we just drag in the projectile color and put that on the value option pin just there. So we're going to get the projectile material and we'll update the projectile color. So the color that we pass in to the material slot called color will be updated for us. And that's pretty much it. We do need to add some collision stuff. We'll get rid of that for the moment, but because we don't really have anything to collide, I don't want to add that in before it's doing anything, because we may not quite understand or forget how it's working, or just take it for granted when we do have things to collide with. So we're going to leave it for now. And we'll come back and add the collision as and when we need it. The final thing we want to do is, if we go to the projectile static mesh and just give this the SM pixel cube, we should see that we have the cube here. And then if we hit simulate, we can see that we have the projectile flying up the screen. So we can at least test. We know that that's working to some extent. Obviously it's not exactly what we want, and we can see it just there on the screen as well. It was moving upwards. So when we start adding the firing functionality, we have something close to a projectile. So that's a good first step. So I'm going to have to try and keep these videos quite short. The UK finally has some warm weather to the stage where my PC is getting quite hot, and I have to close the window to drown out noise, and it's now quite uncomfortable. So I'm going to leave that here again today. As always, if you've enjoyed or found the video useful, then please do leave a like and share. If you'd like to be kept up to date with the latest content, then do consider subscribing to the channel. Just wanted to give another big thank you to my current patrons, Aiko, Blake and Laurent, and if you'd like to consider supporting the channel, then you can go to my Patreon page, which you can get a link to just here in the video, on the left hand side of the screen. As ever though, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.